Hello, hello, and welcome to Arthouse Garage, the snob-free film podcast where we make arthouse, indie, classic, and foreign cinema accessible to the masses. I'm your host, Andrew Sweatman, and today on the show, we're looking at not one but two films from writer-director Jane Schoenbrun. It's the newest from A24, I Saw the TV Glow, and we take a spoiler-free look back at Schoenbrun's 2021 film, We're All Going to the World's Fair. Joining me today is filmmaker Lara Hill, and I'll just go ahead and say, this is one of my favorite podcast episodes I've ever done. Stick around.
I know this might sound crazy. I don't want to alarm you.
Do you remember a TV show we used to watch together? It was called...
The Pink Opaque?
Yeah. Do you watch?
Each episode, they help each other fight a new monster from across the county.
But it's way too scary for most kids.
We're gonna defeat him this time. We're gonna need to harness the full potential of our shared powers.
Sometimes the Pink Opaque feels more real than real life.
Maddie, it was a TV show.
Are you sure that's all it was? I like girls, you know that, right?
Totally, that's fine.
What about you? Do you like girls?
I think that I like TV shows.
It's our destiny.
How can I have a destiny?
Something's wrong. This isn't how life is supposed to feel. Tell me you know it's true.
Maddie, it's just the suburbs.
Seems like you're always somewhere else lately.
Maddie disappeared without a trace. All they found was her TV set burning in the backyard. I told myself I made the right choice. What if I really was someone else? Very far away on the other side of a television screen.
Welcome to Arthouse Garage. That was a bit of the trailer for the new film, I Saw the TV Glow, from writer and director Jane Schoenbrun. This was one of my most anticipated films of the year, and I was so glad to finally see it the other day. I was a big fan of Schoenbrun's previous film, 2021's We're All Going to the World's Fair, so I was excited to see what they would do next, and with a bigger budget. I Saw the TV Glow stars Justice Smith and Bridget Lundy Payne as teenagers who become obsessed with a strange TV show called The Pink Opaque, and it follows how this obsession affects them over time. Joining me today is my friend and filmmaker, Lara Hill. Lara is the writer and director of the short films Invitation and How Do I Tell You This, which I've had a little discussion on the podcast before. I've had the great pleasure of watching Lara's films and having some wonderful conversations about movies with her over the years. And I'm so glad she's here today to talk about I Saw the TV Glow. When we were preparing for this episode, Lara floated the idea, what if we made this a double feature and look also at We're All Going to the World's Fair, which I thought was a great idea. So that's what we're going to do. Lara Hill, welcome to the show. And how are you?
I am doing wonderful, Andrew. Thank you for having me back. It's been quite a long time. A lot has changed since the last time I was on this show.
Absolutely. And I'm so thrilled to have you back, and especially talking about these films, because I know you're a fan of World's Fair, and I saw, tweets and things about being excited for TV Glow. And and I think some of the stuff we've talked about in the past, as far as, at least for me, we'll get into it later, but issues of religion and faith came up for me as watching these films, and so I'm going to touch on that at least a little bit, probably. So anyway, we'll get into that later. So I'm excited to talk about Jane Schoenbrun's movies today, but before we do, I want to talk about your films. I believe you have some news and some projects to tell us about.
Yes, a lot going on lately. Like you mentioned, I have two previous short films that I have made and produced. I believe the last time I was on this podcast, How Do I Tell You This was in the early stages or late stages of post-production and was starting to make its way out onto the festival circuit, so it was not available to watch at the time. However, it is now online and available to watch. You can watch it on, it's featured on Crafty's YouTube channel. I don't know if you're familiar with Alexander Jeffrey and Steve Hellman. They're wonderful, great guys. I've worked with Alex, and he's phenomenal guy, phenomenal filmmaker. And
just had Alex on the podcast recently and met him for the first time. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, wonderful. And yeah, they have hosted featured How Do I Tell You This on their YouTube channel, and Invitation is going to be featured on the YouTube channel here in the next month. But you can actually watch both films right now on my YouTube channel. It's Lara on Set, and those are both available to watch right now. I also have a new short film that I am developing to shoot this coming summer. We are in the early stages of crowdfunding for it. Don't believe a link is available yet, but we will have that ready like within the next few weeks. And I'm really excited for this project. It's going to be the first film that I have made since I transitioned, and it's a story, without giving the game away too much, is largely a story about my transition in a way. So the title of the film is Slip, and it is another romantic drama about a married couple's celebratory date night that is derailed when the wife lets the wrong name slip.
Wow. That sounds wonderful. I can't wait to see that. And whenever that crowdfunding link does come available, I'll definitely be sharing it out so anyone listening can watch Arthouse Garage's social media. Also can follow Lara on social media as well. But yeah, then also link to those other short films, which I have seen and loved. But yeah, I love that premise. That's exciting.
I'm really, sorry. Yes, I'm really excited to get back behind the camera. I've spent the last couple of years like really hitting the ground hard, like kind of building a career on set in other capacities here in New Orleans in the last couple of years, but I'm really excited to actually like be able to be creative on set again rather than just supporting the vision of whatever project. For the record, I love my job. I love what I do. But it's nice to be able to create and make something for yourself.
Yeah, and especially something sounds like it'll be personal, which I know all your films are on some level. But yeah, that sounds great. Well, cool. I can't wait to find out more about that as it comes to fruition and support in whatever ways we can. That sounds great. Well, all right, then I think let's move on and talk about, first we're going to talk about We're All Going to the World's Fair, which I think I will talk briefly to say that I think on this one, we were not going to spoil anything. There is a few things about the ending of this that are spoilable. So we'll withhold that. But then for TV Glow, we're going to do a spoiler-free section, but then we are going to talk about the ending. So we've got...
Yeah, it's very hard to talk about TV Glow without just going full like detail into like what this movie is and what happens in it. But yeah, I think it's important. Like, We're All Going to the World's Fair. It's a much smaller movie, and it's one that I don't think a lot of people have seen. So I would really love for more people to check that out.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, that like I'm sure there are people that will go see TV Glow and have not seen World's Fair, and so that way we can keep this where you can listen, and we're not going to spoil anything about it. But hopefully, I mean, I just learned a lot about a lot of things as I was learning about this movie that I think would have been helpful to know before watching it. So hopefully some of that will be helpful too. But yeah, let's get into the World's Fair. So I was going to ask how many times you've seen it, and what was your experience like, each time? Did you know much about it going in, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I have seen this movie twice. The first time I saw it was back in a couple years ago in 2022, and I decided I wanted to revisit it before TV Glow just because I felt like maybe I would get a little more out of it a second time. I wasn't sure what to expect. Like, I just heard this, like, oh, is this like creepypasta horror movie? And we're going to dive into like the internet and like how, the weird ways that kind of plays with people's minds. And the movie that I got the first time was not really the movie that I expected, just because like it's very quiet. It's very esoteric. in a lot of ways, I would say. Like, it's just the way that it moves and the way that it operates is very unique and strange and of its own, kind of wavelength. And it's not
Yeah.
really traditionally scary the way that a lot of people would expect a horror movie to be.
Mhm.
But it does this wonderful thing about like blurring the lines between, you know, what is real and what is not, in the way that like the just being active on the internet tends to do.
Yeah.
And I admired it a lot the first time I saw it, but I couldn't really say that I got it. And the thing that clicked into the place was, when I came back and revisited it 2 years later, it was a completely different experience. Like, it just
Mm.
kind of opened up to me entirely. And I think the biggest thing that really changed during that time was within those 2 years, like, I had started transitioning myself. And as most people, I think, are aware at this point, Jane Schoenbrun is non-binary, is trans femme. And I knew that when I going into the World's Fair for the first time, and I was expecting a little more of that to come out, and didn't get it the way that I expected to the first
Mhm.
time I saw it, and the second time um, I felt a little bit more of that. I can talk a little bit more about that a little bit, but I want to hear what you think first.
Yeah. I also had a completely different experience, not for the same reason, I think, the second time, but yeah, going into the first time, I knew it was about creepypastas a little bit, and I kind of knew a little bit about that world. Um, but I really didn't know what to expect. I didn't know how grounded in reality is this? Are supernatural things going to be happening? Are there going to be acts of violence committed in this movie? Like, just not knowing anything about how that was going to play out made it a really different experience. But then knowing the ending and watching it a second time and keying into the trans themes a bit more, but really just understanding the ending and then watching it again, knowing a bit more where Casey's head is, the main character, um, just completely different. It really like adds a whole new layer to the film. Um, at least it did for me. And so I liked it a lot the first time, but I loved it the second time, which is just last night. And I was just really blown away by it, and so many things stylistically, which we can talk about in a minute. But yeah, I felt the second experience was much richer. And I think it was also, so I watched that movie back in 2021 or 2022, and then watched TV Glow this past week, and then came back to this film. And I think having also just a little more understanding of this filmmaker and what they're going for also helped unlock some of the uh, bits and pieces of World's Fair that really made it. Like, I just loved this movie last night watching it again. So yeah, that was kind of my experience of revisiting. What did you appreciate about the movie stylistically? And we'll kind of get into some of the thematic stuff too in a minute. But I think, because that was my first takeaway, just like as a filmmaker, what they're doing, on a craft level, I was really impressed by. But yeah, are there anything along those lines that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think so. Something that really World's Fair and TV Globe both share in common is they have this really, like, they bring it about in different ways, but Jane really has this knack for depicting loneliness and isolation,
Mm-hmm.
and making you feel that. And I think in World's Fair, for me, like, what we get is, it's a movie that's largely about the internet and what it's like to be on the internet. And a lot of the shots and the framing, like, I was actually talking with a friend last night who had not seen the film yet, but kind of like what she knew about it was that she understood it as this screen movie, kind of like a
Mm-hmm.
like a live stream movie, a movie that's like, where what we're looking at is a screen. And there are a lot of stylistic elements to the camera work and the way that they frame their shots that makes it look like basically we're looking at them through their webcam. Like,
Mm-hmm.
particularly, we're looking at Casey as she's sitting like at her computer, and we're looking at her like dead on, like we would be looking through the webcam. And we get a lot of shots like that throughout the film. We see, like, when she goes out and takes her camera with her to record um, videos, we're looking at her feed of like what her camera is recording. Later on, we're looking at someone's screen as they're just kind of clicking through videos, and we're watching the videos with them. And
Yeah.
it's such a, like, it's such a very grounded and very realistic view of what it's like to be on the internet, especially when you're that age, when you're that young and have like unfettered access to the internet. Like, it can be a very freeing place and a very fun place, but it can also be really scary and treacherous and isolating. Like, there is like a certain amount of loneliness that comes with existing in those spaces. And I think the movie really does a great job of highlighting that and underscoring, like, and making us feel and see that isolation that she has, particularly because we never see her family. Like, we hear her father in one scene, like he yells at her from, downstairs to like go to bed, but we never see her family or any friends of hers outside of that space. It's just all in her room.
Yeah, absolutely true. And I think the same thing, like I was just immediately struck by the moodiness and like the loneliness feelings that you're talking about. A lot of that is the music, which I had never heard of Alex G, who did the music in this and then also in TV Glow. But they're like one of my favorite artists now. I listen to them all the time. And I did a little bit of reading, and Jane said that they were listening to Alex G a lot as they were making this. And so this is my introduction to them. And I think that kind of shoegazy, like melancholy score does so much for this movie, and like right at the beginning, like pulling you into that mood. And we'll talk about the music in TV Glow as well, because that's a big highlight for me. But yeah, so I really like that about it. And yeah, I had forgotten. Oh, go ahead. Were you gonna say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, should we talk about like what World's Fair is about, like, first?
Yes,
like,
maybe we should. Yeah.
I don't think we've actually like talked about like what this movie is. Like,
yes, and I also feel like maybe there's a little explanation needed about what is a creepypasta if people don't know that. So maybe, a little plot synopsis first. So it's about this young person, Casey, who is isolated in their room pretty much all the time, at least everything that we're seeing in the film. And they do this online challenge, which all we really know is what we see it happening at the beginning, which is they do they have a little incantation. I want to go to the World's Fair, and they say it 3 times, then cut themselves and then bleed on their computer screen while they watch a video, and then we just are watching all these other users' videos who have also done this challenge and the very strange things that are happening to them. And then Casey starts to report that strange things are happening to her as well. And then there's another character who we don't know much about at first, who they connect with online, whose name they just go by JLB, I think, in the film, and who's an older male character who we're not sure their intentions at first, and it's a very interesting relationship. But yeah, that's kind of the premise. And as you said, a lot of this is playing out in sort of found footage, streaming or videos being posted, seeing videos of other users right on our TV screen as if we're watching the computer with her. So yeah, a really interesting setup for a film. And and then I think in the interim too, I came to understand just how much Jane Schoenbrun is fascinated by the creepypasta stuff, and that like they made a whole documentary about Slender Man and Marble Hornets, and realizing this time too how tied to that story this is sort of, I would say this towards the end of this section, but it's almost an homage in a way, but also exploring kind of like the mindsets of people that get into those things. And yes, maybe I'll do a brief, so if you've never heard of the word creepypasta, it is a sort of a unusual very online storytelling. So you've maybe heard of
it's sort of like an urban legend. It's kind of something that is kind of native to the internet, like as far as like the way that it is shared and the way that people engage with it, where it's kind of something that's meant to be shared around and experienced individually. And it's very much like, kids intentionally seeking out things to scare the shit out of themselves. And I've never been super involved in these spaces like where this stuff is shared around, but I have encountered quite a few, and they can be very upsetting and unsettling to find them and experience them sometimes, especially if you're not ready for them. Especially because like I said, on my first viewing, one of the biggest thing I took away from the film was like kind of the way that the film blurs the lines because of its, the nature of its genre and its presentation of just like, okay, what is real and what is not. Like as far as what we were seeing, and the internet has always had like a very strong effect of like blurring those lines of like, okay, how much can we actually know if what we're reading and what we're seeing is real and true? Because we're talking to might be talking to people on the other side of a screen, but we kind of have to trust that they are who they say they are and that their intentions are good or not bad.
Yeah. And I think and we come to understand that Casey is not sure what's real and what's not real, which also ends up being a theme in TV Glow, which we'll talk about. But that's actually a really important part of it, I think, too, because my introduction to the whole world of creepypastas was I just started reading this thing on Reddit and I didn't realize it was fake. I didn't realize it was a written story, which I think is by design. And so I'm like reading this and I'm like, oh my gosh, is this real? Is this true? It's one called the title of it is I'm a search and rescue officer for the U.S. Forest Service. And so they're telling these stories. Have you read that?
It sounds familiar. I think I've heard of this one. Yeah.
It's basically first person of like all these wild things they've seen in the woods. And I was just so like drawn in and scared by it. And then kind of from there learned, oh, this is creepypasta, and like learned about Marble Hornets, which is where Slender Man is from. And it's Marble Hornets is a YouTube series, which I've watched several of that are really frightening, but it's crafted, but it feels the whole idea is like this is a primary document on Reddit or on YouTube or wherever you're seeing for the first time, or like that are being just posted by people, and it's true, but of course it's not. But so Marble Hornets is, I found all these tapes of my friend who was making a film, and he's being stalked by the Slender Man, and there's more lore that kind of pulls out of it, and it's really fun and exciting. And I think it's also like as unique to the internet as all of that is. They're also, if you look at like literature, like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, there's first person letters are part of that narrative. So there's a sort of like pretending this isn't real authentic thing is something that literature has done. So I think it's a really cool. But I think another thing that's unique to the internet is that it's very communal. So it's like I'm reading about the search and rescue officer in the forest, but then I'm commenting with my own stories that I'm of course inventing. But all of that, so it is this communal, like real human connection kind of thing, which is really interesting. But
and I think there's a really cool, interesting thing that I think the film does that to really play into that angle at a certain point that, once, the film opens with her like doing the ritual to like, join the World's Fair, to challenge it. And we see her kind of, start making some videos, talking about her experiences. We start seeing her look at other videos. And once she posts her first video, and she meets JBL and they have a conversation together that I kind of want to circle back to talking about that scene with that, that conversation, because I have some things to say about it. But after that conversation where they talk to each other for the first time, the only way that we engage with her for like the next half an hour of the movie, like the next large chunk of the movie, is we are watching her videos. Yeah. Like we basically kind of assume JBL's perspective of like someone who is only being able to like access her interiority and what she's experiencing through the videos she's making. And that further blows those lines of like, okay, we know this character. We've seen a little bit of their life. We've seen the way that, perhaps she is constructing some of these scares and some of these things that are happening to her, and some of her motivations for doing this. But now we're seeing and all we have to go on for like where she's gone since is the videos she's uploading and making. And we are experiencing them the same way that JBL is experiencing them, of just like, oh, is this real? Is she getting too into this? Like, is this real? And if it's not real, is she getting too into this where it's becoming dangerous to her? Yeah.
Yeah, which totally parallels to the Marble Hornets story, because the big scandal of that is that an actual murder was committed by people who got so obsessed with it.
Right,
which
exactly.
So, and I think not all of that clicked for me the first time watching it, but this most recent time I was like, oh, this really is. It's in a way like examining the mindset of someone who would get so into this. Like, how does this happen? How does this obsession happen? And also like an homage and sort of celebrating the creativity that goes on in those kind of spaces at the same time, which I think is really interesting. And I really appreciated that about it the second time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But so if you will allow me, I figured you assumed that this would be the case, but there's not really a way for me to talk about either of these movies without getting extremely personal.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
To my experience. So, as I mentioned, like the second time that I watched it, again, like going into the film, the first time I was expecting, at that point when I watched this movie for the first time, I knew that I was trans, but I had not started transitioning yet. And I think I had certain expectations for how a trans filmmaker would engage with those themes, and didn't really get those themes packaged the way that I expected them to. And so it kind of largely sailed over my head the first time. But when I came back to it the second time, the biggest thing that hit me over the head like a sledgehammer was how the film also, we've talked about all these things that the film does depict really well as far as, isolation and loneliness and, blurred lines of reality. But a big thing that is present in the film in like, it's extremely subtextual. It's not even expressed this way, but like the biggest thing that stood out to me was that like Casey is experiencing something akin to gender dysphoria and expresses that, like particularly in the conversation of, that first conversation between JBL. Like I think the quote that she says something, largely the World's Fair is a creepypasta. It's never really explicitly defined like what this is, like what the legend is and what exactly it's doing. But a lot of what we're seeing has to do with bizarre changes in behavior and loss of control of your body and like weird transformations of your body. And it just suddenly struck me that, oh, Casey is a teenager and is experiencing puberty for the first time and maybe is not comfortable with those changes that are happening to her body. And the thing that she expresses, like when she talks to JBL, is that like she feels her body, like she feels like she's becoming something else, something bad. And then the thing that she says is, I can't tell my dad about this. He'll think I'm crazy. And like, that's gender dysphoria. Like that is like being trans. Like that's realizing that you are trans in a household that does not accept that. And then from there, like that kind of colored my entire read of the rest of the film, of just like looking at how she is going through experiencing this, of just like, oh baby, you're hurting, you're in pain, it's like,
yeah, that's I didn't think about that as far as just the whole loss of control of the body and like what's going on in my body situation. But of course that makes sense. I did think about, like, there's a line that I wrote in my notes. I can feel myself leaving my body, like it's turning me into someone else, which, and then the same thing about can't tell my father felt very, like I could tell that would resonate. There's also a line here. It's like I'm watching myself through a TV on the other side of the room, which also exactly is almost exactly said in TV Glow as well. But I thought that must play in. And then sadly, like all the suicidality is like, looking at the news and like the statistics, that's a real part of the conversation. And I really came to view this film as honestly, it's like a cry for, like, I think the line we get later is just keep making videos, just keep living, like don't stop. And like that's I was like, this film is really just like encouraging people to keep living, and especially people who are struggling. And I thought that was so beautiful, and I didn't really key into that the first time. So yeah, I thought that was great.
Yeah, I kind of missed it too. And I think a big factor for why I missed that the first viewing also was largely just, my experience of my own transness and how I realized that was, for a very long time, I didn't think that I experienced gender dysphoria. Like my decision to transition and my realization that I was trans was largely influenced by joy and by feeling that like, oh, like my life as it is now is fine, but I think it can be better. Like I think this would be a better fit. And it wasn't until several months into my transition that all of a sudden the wall of TV static that I'd been experiencing the world through was gone. Like I couldn't even identify that it was there at all until I didn't feel it anymore. And so I think that was something that could not be made clear to me through the film, like through this film, just because I wasn't ready to see that and feel that. And I didn't understand what that felt like yet, even though like it was something that was a very like constant and painful part of my life and my experience of the world.
Yeah. Wow. That's very interesting. And I think it's just remarkable to have a film that's engaging with those kinds of things, and now 2 films. And I think, I mean, obviously there are other movies that deal with trans issues, but I think especially with TV Glow now being a somewhat mainstream thing, like people are going to see this movie. And I think that's really exciting that we have that voice on this level. That's cool. I think we're maybe sort of wrapping up the World's Fair stuff, but there was a couple other things I wanted to mention. This is really just stylistic stuff. And I did that. Like, I remember the first time just being struck by like the filming of screens. And then I read on an interview with Jane that they said, I actually haven't seen this film, Harmony Korine's Gummo, but apparently there's a lot of filming of screens in that. And that was something that inspired them.
I'm not surprised to hear that Harmony Korine is an inspiration. I have not seen Gummo either, but that does not surprise me.
It kind of fits, but because there's great moments in World's Fair where like the camera's zooming in on a projected screen at one point, and then suddenly like there's no difference between Casey's screen and our screen, and like the strobing that's lighting up her room is also lighting up the room around me, and like it also kind of blurs the line just in the form of it, which I thought was really cool. And then let's see, I think I had one other little note about the style of this. Actually I had just a quote about, it's just a kind of a behind the scenes thing. Let me pull it up really fast that I found it was on IMDb's trivia section, but I thought it was really interesting. So there's a scene, which for me was the most harrowing scene the first time watching it, when Casey is walking through like a crowd on New Year's Eve, and the kind of it's speaking in ways that are kind of violent, and like I really was not sure what was going to happen in this scene. But the behind the scenes little quote here from Filmmaker magazine, Jane said, "I filmed it on a camcorder, made my partner drive with me upstate. We spent New Year's Eve." So like they went up there, they had been there previously and knew that they did a ball drop in this little town and wanted to put that in the film basically. And like they got one shot to do this. And let's see, I had gone to an
you can't really replicate that, especially on a film that seems to be as low budget as that film is.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that Jane filmed it and then put voiceover with Casey later was how it worked. And here's the end of the quote is, "The idea that Casey would be there filming was one of the early ideas for this film. The loneliness of being in a crowd of people and feeling like you can say whatever you want because no one is listening or even aware that you're there is a big part of that scene." And then this last piece is, "Also, so many of the kids hanging around half a block away from the center of that party were Casey." I was like, oh yeah, there are Caseys everywhere in this town, or in towns like this. So I thought that was a really cool way to realize, how like in a way how widespread that sort of loneliness is. And I thought that was cool. A cool little quote.
Yeah. It's like, it's the internet is such a double-edged sword of, it can be very freeing and very, there's a lot of ways that people can find themselves in online spaces and discover a lot about who they are, but it's also like has the other effect of potentially being extremely isolating and what's the word I'm looking for? Fragmenting, of your experience of the world. There's so many small little communities and enclaves on the internet, and it's very easy to find yourself in a space where, you're, not safe necessarily, and also maybe exacerbates some of what you're feeling and dealing with in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, absolutely true. Really remarkable film, and I think we won't spoil the ending, but like, the ending was even the ending took on a new light, I think, on a second viewing, and I was really impressed by it as well. I do kind of want to talk about it, but we won't because of spoilers. Maybe I'll ask you after we're done.
Of course.
But cool. Anything else about the World's Fair before we move on to TV Glow?
I'm not sure. I think so. Other than like to point out another line, like there is an early scene in the film that I think really stuck out to me, where after she does her little initiation, she takes her camera out into the backyard, out into the woods, out in the snow, and she talks about like, this isn't kind of like her first video documenting like since she started the challenge. And she says, talks a little bit about why she wanted to do it. And she says like, I wanted to do the World's Fair Challenge because I like horror movies and I thought it would be cool to live in one. And the big thing that kind of stuck out to me was just like, we, largely I feel like kind of going back to my earlier comments about maybe, some of the psychology of what Casey is experiencing and, whatever discomfort with her body she is experiencing, it's largely she might be looking for a reason or something that's within her control to give an explanation for why. And I think it occurs to me that like, a lot of trans people feel like, we spend the first part of our lives basically living in a horror movie. And, it can be something that it might be easier to like try to like find a reason for that, to something that's within our control to explain it.
Yeah, absolutely. I have other thoughts around that, but again, it's kind of spoilery, so I won't say it.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, I think the idea of like using the World's Fair as an excuse in a way to, or as an outlet for those uneasy feelings. I think, that's really potent, and I think comes through in the film. I was also just really struck by like the creativity of all the different like the other users' videos and like all the different things we see, and I'm curious about. Because I know a few of those were like directed by other people, I think, because in the credits it mentions. But yeah, just a staggering amount of creativity in all of that and in this film.
I think Jane recruited some people, some friends, to do their own variations on what they think this particular challenge is, and it's very effective, very creative.
I thought it was great. All right, well. Let's move on now to I Saw the TV Glow. And again, we are going to keep the spoiler free at the beginning, and then we'll kind of get into the spoilery stuff later. But actually first, before we even really talk about the movie, I asked you if I could ask this question first. But this film is so much about nostalgia and like fandom. And when I was watching it, there was things that came to mind for me that were like things from my own childhood that I remember being really interested in and really obsessed with. But so I was curious, was there anything like that for you that came to mind?
Oh boy. God, there's probably more, that I've forgotten than I can remember. Sure. But, there's stuff that just comes raging back. I was a really quiet kid. I used books and video games and TV and movies to kind of dissociate and distract myself so much. But I remember like, I was a real bookworm. I remember reading stuff like I was reading like Alex Rider books and Percy Jackson and, I read Harry Potter. I'm grateful that I was not more into Harry Potter, more attached to Harry Potter the way that a lot of, my peers are, and have been. But, I guess TV shows, like I was big into, I didn't have a comic book store, so I didn't read a lot of comics, but I consumed a lot of comic book media. And I particularly remember loving X-Men Evolution.
Oh, nice.
Particularly, like I was very enamored of Rogue in that show.
Yeah.
She's very pretty, and I know plenty of trans girls like myself who
love her.
who she is like gender goals.
Nice.
And and of course you'll probably see in the background my She-Hulk paraphernalia up here.
Oh yes.
She was someone that I encountered sometime in my middle high school years and just felt very attached to her as a character, and she still is one of my favorite, like probably my favorite comic book character, favorite superhero.
Nice.
And then as far as TV shows, I really loved. I remember there was a show called Code Lyoko. I don't know if you remember this, but
It sounds
it was like
vaguely
a,
familiar.
it's like a semi-anime show where these teenagers, kind of go into this virtual internet space to like battle viruses and stuff. Like I can't remember the exact. I can't remember the exact plot, but it's kind of in that same vein of people going into the digital world. Kids going into the digital world to fight monsters and stuff. That I watched a lot after school when I was in middle school and elementary school, I think too. And
that's cool.
There's so many. I could go on forever and ever and ever.
Yeah. Code Lyoko sounds, strangely pertinent to like this discussion. That's cool. For me, I thought about, there's a Disney Channel show called So Weird that dealt with the paranormal it just kind of reminded me. It's like the little clips of the Pink Opaque in the film that like I was really interested in that show. And then on Nickelodeon, Are You Afraid of the Dark? It felt like the edgiest thing that actually I was allowed to watch for a while, but then my parents were like, you shouldn't be watching this. But I loved it so much. It was like the only horror thing really that I could access at that age, I think.
There wasn't a lot of stuff like that I wasn't allowed to watch because it would be scary. It was the more common thing for me was I wasn't allowed to watch just because my parents either thought it was annoying or thought it was like, gross or sinful or like promoted like bad ideas or what have you, but
totally all that for me too.
Another thing I just thought about was Animorphs. I was deep into Animorphs as a kid.
That's cool.
And like generally this maybe goes without saying, but almost anything that had to do with like transformation of some sort was like a big draw for me.
I wonder what that was about.
I wonder really do.
Another show that I thought of too was I don't even remember, much like in the film TV Glow, like if I went back and watched this I probably wouldn't like it at all, but Ghost Rider was this, I think it was a PBS thing, but there was a ghost that would like help these kids write, but I was also like kind of creepy, and I was like so drawn to it because I was like, it feels a little bit transgressive or something, like just because I was like, this is scary and maybe I'm not supposed to be watching it or whatever. So that I thought of that too, and because like the ghost image that we see in TV Glow as well, like kind of reminded me of that. But then the other like fandom that I was into, and there's a whole thing, but like I was really into The Legend of Zelda, like the video games.
Ooh, yeah.
And actually there's a creepypasta about that. It's called Been Drowned, where someone gets like a haunted version of a Majora's Mask and like creepy stuff happens in the screen. So I haven't read it yet, but I'm about to replay Majora's Mask, which is creepy anyway, and then I'm going to read it after that. But anyway, I then kind of didn't play video games for like a decade and kind of rekindled that as sort of a inner child thing. I don't know, but I've gotten way back into Zelda. I'm buying books. I'm buying action figures. It's a whole thing now, which is also an aside here. I have a podcast episode coming up about Zelda. It's a documentary about a trans woman who is a speedrunner, like a Twitch streamer, and it's kind of about an interesting story that happens with them. It's called Break the Game. I interviewed the director. I got to nerd out about Zelda. That's coming out in the next few weeks. So brief little plug for that.
Amazing.
But
that reminds me a lot. I have a friend who is a filmmaker and a trans woman and is polishing up a documentary that she has been making for the last couple of years. That's about the Super Smash Brothers Melee community, because she is very involved in like competitive Super Smash Brothers, which I don't know if you know or any of your listeners know, but like there is a very large and very active community around that game and playing it competitively. Specifically
Melee, which is like a few years old. Like there's newer versions since
several years. Like Melee was a game that came out, I think, in the early to mid 2000s.
It's the GameCube one, right?
It's GameCube. It's 20 years. It's at least 20 years old, and people still play it. And that like they have in the community has kind of decided that is like the best version of that game with the mechanics, the characters, the way that everything works, and yeah, I'm really excited to see what she comes up with. She's actually attached to edit my edit slip
Oh,
for me.
nice. Great.
So yeah,
Well, that sounds awesome. I can't wait to see that. That's really cool. I think my son is probably playing Super Smash Brothers in the other room right now. That's so, like, as I got into video games again, I was able to, like, oh, it's like a family thing now. And we're playing Mario
what's
Kart a lot.
what's his main? What character does he play?
He loves to be Bowser. He's obsessed with Bowser. Like, I'm a little nervous about it. Not really, but he's like he thinks Bowser's cute. He's like, Bowser's cute. I was like, he's the bad guy, right? He's like, no, he's cute though. Okay, whatever.
He's a bad guy, but he's also a big chunky, like
Yeah.
big chunky spiky monster.
Yeah, I think so. That's so funny. But yes, anyway, the Zelda stuff is a big deal, and yeah, I definitely thought of, like, the amount of obsession that we see in this film. Like, I haven't really had that about anything except Zelda. Like, I have an alt account where I tweet about Zelda because it's the only time I've ever been that into something. Anyway, yeah, there we go. Nostalgia and obsession are important, and I think there was a time when I thought that I shouldn't, go down those rabbit trails so much or something. But I think, yeah, but part of growing, like, inner child stuff, as I mentioned, was like, no, this is okay, and this is actually, like, part of who I am, and it's really cool. And I think this film kind of touches on those things too. So, anywho, let's talk about the film. So first, what was your anticipation like for this film? Did you know a lot about it going in, and what was your kind of experience with that?
Oh boy. So the trailer for this dropped. Like, first of all, I had my eye on Jane, whatever they were going to be doing next, because I had seen World's Fair, and I knew of that they were, I had heard that they were doing another movie. And the movie specifically that I heard about was their upcoming movie called Nevada, which is an adaptation of a book. And I haven't read this book, but I know a lot of people who are very familiar with it and love it. And it actually helped a friend do tape an audition for this movie.
Oh, wow.
So, I knew of that movie, that was getting made. So I was really shocked and surprised for Sundance to roll around this year and hear that, hey, they have a new movie out, and it's not that. And I'm like, oh, what's this? And I don't know, I heard rave reviews out of Sundance, and then that first trailer dropped, and I was like, oh my God, like, that is a whole vibe. And that looks like I just, like, the vibes of it felt so, like, very singular and sad and melancholy, but also, like, I just, like, became weirdly obsessed with it. Like, I watched that trailer over and over and over again, the way that I haven't done with a movie trailer in years. And eventually, as I, like, the more and more I watched it, the more I became familiar with it, I started picking up on things in the trailer that pointed to, like, oh, this is going to have a lot of trans stuff in it. And I became even more excited. So yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I got to go to Sundance this year, which was a dream come true, which was so cool. I didn't get to see it there, and I wanted to. It was packed, and it was, like, hard to get tickets, whatever. So I caught it at Overlook Film Festival, which is a horror movie film festival here in New Orleans. And I was literally, like, it was the screening I went to was the second screening of the festival, and I was literally the last person they seated. Like, I bought an individual ticket. They filled 2 theaters from the pass holder line. I was, like, the 4th person in line that had, like, an individual ticket, and I was the last person they seated for the movie. So yeah, packed theaters. Yeah, a lot of people were excited for this. Yeah, that's how I was at Sundance too. And so I didn't think I was going to tell this whole story, but I had a press badge, which was so exciting, and I didn't really understand how it all worked. But I got there, like, oh, here's the press line, and it's really full. And I was like, if my plane is on time, I can get there in time for TV Glow. Like, that was my goal, because it was like the first thing I was going to be able to see. And I got there, and the line was so packed, and I got in line, and then somebody literally physically grabbed me. It's like, no, you have the second tier press badge. You have to go to this other line. And then none of us.
They have tiers to the press.
Yes, which it makes sense, but I just didn't know that, and so I was very disappointed in that moment. But yeah, like, I'm not accredited and stuff. Like, I get it. I get why. But it was, I was like, oh, you're going to literally yank me out of this line. I was so sad to not see it. But I did eventually see it last week. So there's that whole thing. But in the meantime, I saw the trailer as well, and I think I was curious to see, like, would this same kind of loneliness vibe, moodiness translate to a bigger budget? Because so much of that was found footage kind of feeling in World's Fair, but it felt, you could feel it in the trailer, like, oh yes, absolutely, that's going to translate to a bigger budget. And then the only thing I was like curious about was having a recognizable actor in Justice Smith. I was just kind of like, and I wasn't, honestly, not that familiar with their work. And I'll say in a second that worry was not totally unfounded. I thought they did an incredible job in the film, but yeah, that was my big kind of like, oh, interesting, because I think so much of World's Fair is like all these unknown people made it feel so like authentic, and then maybe that's a different movie, maybe that was important for that movie, but not for this. But yeah, well, I guess we don't have to talk about it again, but I thought Justice was incredible in this, and all the actors really. But
absolutely, like performances really stand out in this movie. That just like Justice Smith, he, like, I'd seen him in a bunch of other stuff, like, and I think I've seen him play characters like mostly in blockbusters. Like, I know he was in the Detective Pikachu movie, and I think the first time I was aware of him and became aware of who he was Jurassic World 2, where he plays this like really shrill character who screams about every 2 seconds, and it just seemed like he was being given a lot of roles where he got to be like very loud and hyperactive and kind of shrill and annoying. And I was, I had kind of become aware that, he was queer and maybe was starting to do a lot more, like, not necessarily serious work, but work that highlighted that. And so I was very surprised with his performance of just this way that he carries himself and the way that he speaks in this film is so, like, it's this raspy, like, choked up, like,
same thing,
pain, like, just pained expressions of, like, just kind of holding himself, like, very closely and tightly, like, and just is very timid, and that felt very relatable and very and very sad. And Bridget Lundy Payne also is incredible in very different ways, like giving like a very different performance where she has the character Maddie has this intensity just to her, like the way that she expresses herself. She's very passionate and very like direct and intense, particularly like anytime she gets to talk about this, the Pink Opaque with people, and it just like you feel like how like this is sort of like this show is like such a lifeline for her, that like she's grabbing onto it like with her full fist, and it's not willing to let it go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think their performance is so good as well, and that intensity that you mentioned, and this isn't really a spoiler to say, I think it even shows in the trailer, like time passes. And so like even seeing the way they transform over time is really interesting, which a lot of that's makeup, but I think it's also performance. But then, what you said about Justice Smith, I was going to mention it in particular, the voice, because choked up is the word. It constantly sounds like he's on the verge of tears, like he needs to clear his throat almost, which I thought was such an incredible choice as an actor to do that, because I think it lent so well to this role. And I just was not prepared for Justice Smith to give this kind of performance either, and I was so impressed by it. So that was a really cool thing. Yes, great performances. Is there anything else like about the craft of the film that you want to mention before we get into spoilers and thematic stuff?
Yeah, I really want to point out the production design, because it is like, that was something that I saw the film a second time last night, and brought a friend with me, and that was one of the things that we left talking about, was how wonderful the production design is. The film it starts out in the 90s at least, and then moves through the 2000s, and even later, I want to say like maybe up to the present day.
That was my feeling too.
And it really does like a phenomenal job of like designing like what the 90s looked like I had forgotten some things. Like I remember like there's a scene where young Owen goes to meets Maddie in the cafeteria of the school, and they hang out between these vending machines, and one of the vending machines is like has the Fruitopia panel. And I'm just like, God, like I had forgotten that drink existed.
Completely.
Like, and the design of it is like the most 90s thing in the world. And so much of the production design like is very accurate to the period, but like as the film progresses and plays out, you see like everything kind of has this glow to it, and you start seeing the ways that, you know, the world of the show starts infecting the world, like Owen's world, and like what we're seeing. And it's just really, really beautiful. And Jane is so plugged into like, you know, more, this may be more thought thematically, but I think it comes through in the production design too, is so plugged into like the media we consume as kids. Like, you know, I obviously knew that they, you know, from World's Fair, that they had a really strong grasp on the internet in a way that a lot of filmmakers still don't today. I think TV Go really shows like an even deeper understanding of not just the internet, but of just like childhood media period, and the way that we experience those, you know, the way that a kid's mind experiences the things that they love, and things that, you know, they feel seen in, too. And the way that kind of spills out into the world for them. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, it's so cool that Owen is drawn to it before he's even seen an episode. Like he's seen the commercial, and then he sees her with the book, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, that's the thing that I am so interested in, but I haven't even engaged with it." And that felt true as well.
I've had so many shows like that I like wanted to watch or have wanted to get into and never did.
Yeah. Like you said, the Fruitopia thing totally stood out to me too, and like so many things about the production design. I want to mention the music, as I mentioned again. Alex G does the score and like the music supervisor for a lot of some of the music is like right in the text, like the diegetic. So music is a bigger part of this when they're at the double lunch bar or whatever it's called. That an incredible scene with a couple of artists there. That absolutely love it. And like all of the music in this just is so of a piece, and the soundtrack is
the soundtrack is incredible. And the one bit that haunts me more than anything is actually like the song that appears in the trailer of the film. And I wasn't expecting it to be in the movie, but it actually bookends the film. It's in the opening of the film, and it also shows up at the very end. Is this really gorgeous and haunting cover of Anthems for a 17-Year-Old Girl, which is a Broken Social Scene song. And I think the artist for this cover is an artist named Yule. And the way that they, you know, I had not encountered that song before. Like I heard the cover in the trailer, and I went back and listened to it, and the way that their cover kind of plays with memory in the way that you remember, because this is a song that like people who love Broken Social Scene, love that band, like this is like one of their most beloved songs. And the cover of this song like really does some really cool things, where it kind of remixes and changes the order of like the lyrics and the bridge and all that, and doubles back on itself, and it like plays with, you know, the way that we kind of engage, almost like you're listening to like an old, like deteriorated version of the song that's skipping back and forth. And it's just really cool, and also like plays into the themes of the movie perfectly. Not just the lyrical content of the song, but what they do with it, the construction of it.
That's super interesting. I didn't know all of that. I knew that it was a cover. I think the original is in Scott Pilgrim. That's why I knew it. I think it's called that soundtrack. But then I intentionally didn't listen to the soundtrack to this before watching it, but I did look into some of the artists, and I listened to some Yule songs. Yule's really cool and interesting. They're non-binary and a little scary, and like I really like what they're doing a lot. So I encourage people to check that out. But yeah, that rendition of the song is incredible, and I didn't even pay close enough attention to all of the changes that you mentioned. That's really cool. Just visually, I mean, this is in the trailer, like you get the sense of, well, but like all the TVs were literally glowing, and like the way that things are lit. It's a lot of pink and purple hues, which is definitely a trans sort of a reference as well. I mean, like another nostalgic thing, the big parachute, like
I'm
going inside the parachute. Yeah,
I'm
you can
I'm
talk about
trying
that.
I'm trying to hold back on
Okay.
this conversation, on this part of the conversation. But
Then I
yes,
will.
I have thoughts.
I will hush on that then. Let's see. I'm trying to think if I had anything else non-spoilery before we get into all that. One other thing that did remind me of World's Fair, there's like in the way that we have, screens within screens and the sort of meta nature of like, we're now watching what she's watching and all of that. There's a similar kind of meta feeling in the planetarium scene, which is kind of what's happening there is kind of spoilery, but just like the way that it draws us into what she's saying and like kind of the monologue there, I really was kind of reminiscent of that. And I was just
and that's such a remarkable monologue, not just because of what it's saying, but like that is like a very long, very wordy bit of exposition dump. But the way that Bridget delivers it and the way that the camera holds on it, like one thing that there's two bits that stood out watching it a second time to me was this moment. A lot of it, like at the very beginning, is like you see Maddie, see them in like this side profile as they're talking, and then eventually they move to the control panel, and the moment, and they're just describing this really harrowing and scary and terrifying experience that they had, and the moment that they kind of move into talking about this freedom that they experienced, and like the camera just starts pulling back, and moving into this wide shot, and eventually, the whole the whole planetarium is showing all these like constellations floating around, and like when she finally gets to like the final point of the truth, like revealing the truth, and she hits the button that like turns all the constellations into like the fully formed like artwork of like the people and figures that they represent. It's all like the craft is so intentional and meticulous in this movie, that like there's so many creative choices that really enhance and make the experience of like, it's a very talky movie. There's a lot of talking in this movie, and I think it could be the kind of movie that a lot of people, especially if they're expecting a traditional horror movie going into it, might lose some of those people, and they might be bored by it because there is so much talking. But the way that Jane constructs and directs all of it is so visceral and so engaging and smart and clever.
Yeah, completely agree. And so I think we're about to move into spoiler territory. So before we do, I'll just say anyone that's been listening and hasn't watched it yet, you can tell we both really like it and we recommend it. And I think you see it on the big screen while you can, because of how visually incredible it is, and the music, all of that, just being really immersed in it, I think is
ringing endorsement from me. It is, as of now, it is my favorite movie of the year, and I do not see any film unseating it from that spot.
I feel the same way. I think I was like, is this the best thing I've seen all year? I think it might be. So anyway, yes, big endorsement. And now, if you have not watched it, tune out. We're going to talk spoilers. We're going to talk thematically and about the ending and everything.
Yes.
So
yes, I feel like there is no real way to talk about this movie without like going deep into and what it means and what it's doing thematically without getting into spoilers. And that is that like this movie is extremely trans. It is trans all over the place. Like it is. And now like this is going to be my opportunity to just trans all over the place here.
yes.
Well, if you want to say something, get some words in first.
No, absolutely. Feel free, and I'll I have maybe a few things that at the end, but open up. The floor is yours, Lara.
Yes. The big thing that I've seen, like I've seen a lot of people talking about this movie, and obviously even people that do love it have been really zeroing in on like the way that it depicts nostalgia and media engagement, and the way that kids are, become obsessed with things. But I haven't seen very many. I've seen a lot of cisgender people. That's people who are not transgender. Kind of, maybe they make a reference to the trans themes or, the the trans allegory, as some people have said, but they don't really go in depth about it. Maybe it's an element of they feel like, that's not really something that they could really discuss, with any kind of authority, or maybe it's things. But I think it's the kind of thing, like, this is a film that really cannot be properly understood without the context of, like, this is a trans story. It's very central and core to the film. And it was a thing that was, obviously, like, as a trans person, I was very primed for that reading, and primed to pick up all of those signals. But, like, I was not expecting it to hit me, like, right away. Like, literally, the film opens with Owen, like, in the scene where Owen is just sitting at home alone, sitting on the couch in his living room, and he flips on the TV, is flipping through channels, and he sees the ad for the Pink Opaque for the first time. And after it shows us the ad, it cuts to his face. It's like this medium close up, and the camera just stays there for a really, really, really long time, like longer than I think anyone else would. And as the camera stays there, we just suddenly see his face go completely, like, glazed over and distant, and, like, this, you see this sadness take hold. And I immediately was just like, oh, I know what that is. Like, I know what that is. I've had that look. I've had that feeling. That's, like, extremely extreme. That's, like, an extremely, like, trans thing, to see that sadness set in, like, when we are young. And from there, like, it just kind of kept getting stronger. Like, immediately, like, the next scene after that, you mentioned the parachute scene earlier. I am certain that parachute was red, white, and blue in real life, but they color grade the hell out of it to make it look like the colors of the trans flag, which you can see right there in my room. Yeah. And I was just like, yeah, this movie's going to fuck me up.
And it did.
Oh, yep. It 100% it did. I was like, I will be honest, it took me 2 whole days to decide whether or not I even liked it, because I got to the end of the film, and so the whole trajectory of the narrative is Owen is this kid who is very lonely, very quiet, seems very sad. His mother keeps commenting on, like, you always seem so far away. You seem like you're somewhere else, or trying to fight to, like, get him engaged, or try to reach him. And he finds his lifeline. He meets Maddie, and Maddie is into this show, The Pink Opaque, which is kind of like this Buffy style monster of the week, supernatural TV show, in which these two teenage girls discover that they have, like, a psychic connection, and use their psychic powers to fight this big bad who is, like, seeking to, like, make, creating all these monsters and seeking to, like, make the world sad. Like, the name of the monster, the big bad, is Mr. Melancholy, and he takes the form of, like, this moon up in the sky, this big, like, with a face on it. And I am sure, again, like, Jane is, very upfront and very queer with her influences. I think there's a lot of stuff. Obviously, Buffy is in there. I think there's a lot of connections to Twin Peaks here, but yeah. I had a conversation with a friend where they kind of pointed out that Mr. Melancholy almost certainly at one point was Mr. Melancholy, as a reference to Smashing Pumpkins.
Yep.
So there's a lot of references to, like, old media, old films, TV shows, music.
The name The Pink Opaque is, I don't know if you're going to say this, is the name of a Cocteau Twins album, actually.
Okay, I did not know that.
Which
actually.
I know Jane also is a fan, like, mentioned in an interview, listening to them a lot.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And the older that, and Owen is not allowed to watch this show, not because of anything in it, but because it just comes on too late at night. But he sneaks over to have a sleepover with Maddie and watch the show for the first time. And over the course of the next few years, she starts making tapes for him to watch it. And they kind of have this very low-key, almost secret friendship for a long time based around this show. And the older they get, there seems to be more that both of them relate to and see themselves in it. The line becomes, sometimes it feels more real than real life. And
Yeah.
ultimately, like, that connection, that seeing himself in this show and the reflection of himself back at him is something that he keeps running away from, keeps being scared of and running away from throughout the movie. And we get these long time jumps later on. I think it jumps ahead 2 years, from when he's his youngest. And then after that, it's 8 years. And then eventually we get like a very big jump a very large jump that when it popped up, the title card popped up for 20 years later, my heart sank so bad, so hard. And the ending of this movie is just so, like, it made me so sad, like, for reasons that we'll probably get into later after you have a chance to talk about it some more. But the ending made me so sad and distraught that, like, again, it took me a couple of days to really decide whether or not I liked it. Like, this movie is so, like what it's playing with thematically is so visceral to, like, the trans experience and to just this particular, like, experience of the world, that, like, it can be really harrowing. And, like, I've warned a lot of my friends that, like, you need to see this, it's gonna wreck you.
Yeah.
I'll let you have a word.
Yield the floor. No, yeah, that's also interesting to hear. And yeah, the ending was so gutting, and it's like this movie really is like a cautionary tale, I think. Like, yeah, just showing how. So, I was keying into a lot of the trans stuff as well. Just, I think I knew that from Twitter and stuff that was going to be part of it. And yeah, like, definitely not all the details that you mentioned, but like the colors. And then so what happened for me too was I started thinking about other movies. So I actually thought a lot about The Matrix, which I know is
absolutely
big trans readings of that.
This movie is The Matrix if it was a sad girl horror movie, and if Owen keeps being offered the red pill and he keeps taking the blue pill instead because he's terrified.
And it destroys him over time. That's what it
destroys him.
So fucking hard.
It is so hard. Continue.
Yeah, just so, like, the Matrix connection for me, this is where I get into the religious talk, because when I watch things like The Matrix, and it's Plato's allegory of the cave, of, like, looking and stepping into the real world, right? Like, going through some sort of a transition. For me, that I always think about when I left the church and how hard that was, and stepping away from this whole worldview that I've always had and the community that I've always had around all of that. And so those things are going off in my head as I'm, learning about the sort of the conversion experience of burying yourself alive, dying to yourself. And so some of these, like, Christian ideas were resonating around in my head. And so that's how I thought about it. And I think if I watched this movie when I was on the cusp of leaving and I was, like, afraid to leave, I think it would have just shattered me. And, like, the moment that when it is in the trailer, which I forgot that it was, but it's like at this point in the movie, we've figured out, like, that's kind of what's going on, is that he's denying this true self and, like, not going to open up in that way. At least, we're fingers crossed that he's going to. And then it cuts and we finally see the street and it says, "There's still time." That's the moment I started just fucking crying. And
there is still time. That is a phrase that gets shared a lot in my community, because I will say, so if it is not clear, like, what becomes very clear over the course of the film and the turn that it takes is that it becomes very clear that Owen and Maddie are the characters in the show that they are watching. And like, Owen specifically is this girl named Isabel, and Maddie is actually Tara. And they've kind of been, like, the last episode of the show before it was canceled depicts those characters being captured by the big bad and sort of being put into this trance, what's called the nightmare realm. Or is it? No, it's called the Midnight Realm.
The Midnight Realm.
I've gotten that wrong a couple times. In the Midnight Realm. And what eventually Maddie disappears after a long time and then returns, and she is the one that, like, tells Owen that, hey, you are Isabel, and this is the Midnight Realm. and and we're trapped, and you are dying, and that just becomes really clear that like um, that idea of that's very true to like the trans experience of just like feeling like we up to that point we've been watching this story play out where Owen and Maddie both just feel very isolated and lonely in this world and feel like everything is wrong and not quite right, and finally there's this truth that really Maddie discovers. And I think there is a point where Owen becomes aware of the truth and maybe won't accept it for himself. And it's just something that, the idea of like knowing the truth, but being so terrified of that truth because of what it means, because of how destabilizing and big and scary that truth is, even if it is something that is like liberating and is going to like save you. And that idea of like there is still time. So many trans people, especially older ones who are like still in the closet, feel like even young ones like me. Like I'm 30 years old. I'm about to turn 31. I started transitioning when I was 29 and knew that I was trans when I was 27. And even people my age think that like, oh, like it's too late for me. I've already gone through, my body is what it is. Like I'm going to look ugly, or I'm going to look cocky. Like I'll never not look trans. Or maybe they're just even older people. I think about one of my friends who transitioned in her 60s, but she knew since she was a kid. And there's that fear of just like, oh, I have too much. I have a family. I have a life. I have a career. And if I do this, if I embrace this part of myself, I am going to lose all that. Like it's very scary, but is the truth. Like, and again, like that phrase, we share that all the time of like, there is still time. Like, because so many of us, we think like, oh, it's too late for me. And it's never too late. It's never too late it's never too late to embrace who you are and take those steps. It's going to be really scary, but it's going to save you. And that's ultimately what we see is the film. Like you said, it's a cautionary tale, because like literally like that, like I said, that title drop of like, Maddie, after she disappears, Maddie comes back and tries to save Owen. It's like save Isabel. And once again, she runs from it, like she flees from it. And then the next thing is 20 years later, Owen has a family herself, and we see her decaying and decrepit on screen, like wheezing and withered husk. And it's just like literally, like I think going back to the production design and what I mentioned about like the ways that like the show starts to infect the production design, like at this point Owen is working in this like fun center arcade things, and all of the games have elements from the show, like have like the moon and Mr. Melancholy and the little henchman, and literally there's like one that has like a digital board on it, and it just flashes over and over again, you are dying. And it's like, and it's just, it becomes this like really like visceral cautionary tale about being too scared to make that jump, like knowing the truth and knowing what you need to do and being too scared to do it.
Yeah, all of that. Yes. And I think I like that they included the moment when so first of all, it's interesting that there's so much fourth wall breaking. I didn't expect that. Like they turned to the camera and talked straight to us, which is another thing that I think enhances the feeling that like this film is talking straight to you. Like there is still time, and like the sort of the nature of this film trying to save people. It's so incredible. But that there's a moment when Owen says, I have a family now. And like
it is the saddest line in the movie. The way that he delivers it is just like, I have a family of my own now. I love them more than anything. It is like the most flat, sad, passionless delivery like of the entire film. And it is the saddest line of the movie. Like I was just like, oh God, like it was like a knife in my heart. And
it resonated with me to thinking about the religious side of things, and like,
Mhm.
you know, there definitely was a time when I was like, well, I can't leave the church now. I can't make this kind of a big change now. I have a family. Like, this has got this doesn't affect just me anymore. And so, like, the fact that that was included as I'm already thinking about all of these things was like, oh my gosh, like, I just didn't expect that. And yeah, so it resonated for that reason as well. There's a few things. Let's see if I had any other notes. Oh, one other thing that I did clock, as far as like probably being like a trans experience thing, was it's similar to in World's Fair, the parent saying, at one point, Owen says, "Can I stay up late and watch this?" And he says, "Isn't that a show for girls?" And so, like, just that little moment
Again,
of,
like a knife in the heart. Like, oh,
yeah,
oh
yeah,
boy, that hurts.
yeah,
Yeah. God, there was something else that was like on the tip of my tongue, like, that I forgot. I think another wonderful thing, and this was like something that, like, it's not so much like my read. It's something that I want to touch on because I've seen this read, said, of just like people talking about, like, oh, this film is about the danger of nostalgia and how, like, obsession with media and with fiction can consume you, and you can just disappear into that, and it can, like, wreck your life. And I think that that's, I don't necessarily want to say that anyone's take on the film is wrong, but that is a read that completely ignores the trans aspect
yeah. I
of the
didn't
film,
think of that.
because and the thing that they point to is, like, there's a moment later on where, like, again, years later, it's after the point that Maddie has come back and tried to save him, where he says, like, oh, like, I started watching the Pink Opaque again because it's on streaming and I can watch it, and he pulls it up, and it is a completely different show now. Like, it's a lot cheaper, it's a lot more kiddie. Like, the people, like, the characters in it are like literal children, and it's very kitschy and very childlike, and it's this element of just like, oh, like, nothing is ever the same as it was when we were kids. This type of thing of just like, oh, like, this obsession, this childhood obsession is not the same as it used to be, or whatever. And it's like, yeah, but it's like, it's more, I see that moment instead of like an indicator of just like, oh, like, this is wrong to get bogged down in this, and more of an example of the ways that shame can color, like, especially as we get older, the way that shame about the things we liked as kids can color and make us kind of run from, like, the ways that we saw ourselves in that. Because, usually if you saw yourself in a piece of media as a kid, there was probably a reason for it. Like I said, like we talked about earlier with some of the media that that I liked growing up as a kid, like, something that I kept coming back to as far as characters I liked, shows I liked, concepts I liked, was like a lot of sci-fi stuff that had to do with, like, some kind of transformation or shapeshifting. And, that's something that, ended up being kind of core to my being, of just like, there's a reason for that, because I was really unhappy with the person I was, and my body felt wrong to me, and I, that was something that was attractive. And similarly, if there's something that you connected with as a kid, there's probably a reason for it. You don't have to get super deep about it necessarily. Maybe it's not that deep, but there probably was a reason for it, and there's not a reason to feel shame about it. And it is like a moment of horror, because, like, when he just rediscovers and revisits that show, and we see how, I guess, the Midnight Realm has, like, warped, the show to be something different, and the camera just, like, zooms in and spins on his face, and you just suddenly hear, like, again, Owen has had this, like, rasp in his voice the entire film, and it just suddenly is just like, that's all it is, where it's just like that raspy breathing of just like, you feel him decaying in that moment. Like, this, he spent his entire life up to this point running from the truth and running from who he was, and now his one connection to who he was that made him feel seen, his one lifeline, has been ruined for him. And you just, from that moment, you just feel him start decaying. And it's so fucking sad. I'm sorry I'm swearing so much. I don't know.
It's fine.
Like,
totally fine. Yeah, don't worry about that at all. I was going to ask about that moment and how you felt about it, because it was kind of confusing to me initially, and I thought, on some level, is it saying that, like there's still time, there's always still time, but it's harder to connect with those things maybe as you get older, and
Mhm.
like to connect with that part of themselves
It's
to,
easy. It's easy
yeah.
to forget. It's easy to forget. You forget a
Mhm.
lot. Like once I started, one of the things that I did once I started kind of exploring my gender identity and realizing that I was trans was I started documenting feelings, like different like thoughts and feelings that I had around my gender
Mm.
identity, like things that things that I liked as a kid, or maybe thoughts that I remember having, and the more of that exercise I did, like, I kind of expected, like, okay, maybe there's like a few things that I can document here or whatever. Uh, Kind of more of, part of my, exploration. But the more I did it, the more things just kind of came back to me, like things that I had
Mm.
forgotten. Like I suddenly remembered, like, oh yeah, like I did have dreams like that
Mm.
when I was a kid. And it's a very common joke in our community, just like, oh, like there were no signs, quote unquote, there were no
Mm.
signs,
Right,
like
right,
when
right.
people, you know, are surprised when someone comes out as trans or whatever. And it's just like, the more we look back and the more,
Mm.
on our childhood and look at it, the more that like things materialize. And it's just like, yeah, you do forget a lot. And the older you get, the easier it is the older you get, the easier it is to forget. And I
Yeah.
think that that's something that rings true in that moment.
Wow. Yeah, that's so interesting. And thinking about like what art resonated with me as a kid too. First of all, I've started doing EMDR in my therapy, and that shit is
Mm-hmm.
crazy. Like the way memories that I had
Yes.
never thought I would ever think about again will come up.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my gosh, I forgot about that. But yeah, just like stories of people being rebellious or like running away from home, and like I think so much of that I can see is like even back then for me, I could tell that this evangelical Christian worldview was just inadequate to uh, the real world, and like, I felt so guilty for having friends that weren't Christians. And anyway, so all of that to say that like, yeah, uh, it is amazing how um, things from our childhood can point to those kind of deeper stuff that we didn't realize was going on. Um, I love the whole metaphor of the show, the Pink Opaque,
Mm-hmm.
melancholy being the ultimate evil that
Yeah.
hopefully doesn't get you in the end. And
Yeah. And I will say, like, that's something that, like, before I transitioned, I always called myself like a very melancholy person. Like I just felt very, very sad, like all the time, like something was wrong. And there were a lot of things that had to do with that. Like there was a lot of things in my life that I wasn't very happy about. But you know, as I started like kind of addressing a lot of those things, like it just kind of, the more it's kind of like an onion, like the more you peel away, the closer you get to like what's actually like the problem. And it's not necessarily, transition didn't fix everything, but it fixed a lot of things. It changed a lot of things. And it's funny, we mentioned The Matrix earlier. The Matrix is another one of those films that like obviously a lot of trans people connect to that film, myself included. Like I don't know if you have seen my tattoo.
I didn't know. I haven't. Nice, I love it.
Yeah. I remember where I was when I was a kid when I saw that movie for the first time.
Wow.
Like I remember like down to the most minute detail, like where I was when I saw that movie for the first time. And it's been a movie that has stuck with me. And the Wachowskis have been filmmakers that, as I got older, I started to realize how much their work generally had meant to me. And there was a reason for that. And I honestly think like this movie, I Saw the TV Glow, is like going to be like the Matrix for like the next generation of trans people who like discover themselves through this movie.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that comparison, and I think I did have the thought like this is almost like a Gen Z Matrix or like something like that. But I think you put it better. Like it's a sad girl like trans Matrix.
Yes.
Yeah, I absolutely love this movie. Let's see. I want to talk a little bit more about the ending, like the specifics of the ending, maybe.
Yes.
Just because it's kind of a confounding a little bit ending. And
yes.
I think so. Yeah, go ahead.
I
Go
can
ahead.
see the ending making a lot of people mad. It made
I've
me
already
very
seen.
sad.
I've seen people like, what the hell was this? Like, not just like being mad about the ending already on
Yeah,
Twitter and stuff. But
yeah,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. I will say so. The ending of the film is, again, we have now cut to 20 years later after Maddie tried to save Owen, who we know as Isabel, and she is now working in this fun center. Has been working there for the last 20 years, and is just deep into middle age, and is clearly like just withering away. And
Mhm.
there's this moment where finally she's at work and she just can't take it anymore, and she screams like, it's this very surreal moment, because when
Mhm.
she screams, like suddenly the world around her just stops, like
Yeah.
all of the people around her stops, and she just screams. She's like, I'm dying, like, you gotta help me, like trying screaming for Isabel. And when it just becomes clear that no one is coming to save her, she ends up going to the bathroom, and it's a very surreal scene. Like, as she's like rasping like on the ground, like she's taken like her shirt off and everything, and she takes this box cutter that she has and like cuts her chest open. And I don't necessarily know if we're meant to interpret it as an act of suicide. It's a very fine line with like the suicide imagery here, but when she opens up her chest, like she doesn't bleed or anything. She opens up her chest and there's like the TV screen inside of her, like that's playing the show. Like, it's kind of like that. I guess it's like a symbol of like the core of like who she is. Like, it's like
Still
a
deep in
reminder,
there.
of like who she actually is inside. And you think that maybe that's going to be something hopeful and good, but then it cuts back and she's like, got her uniform back on and clothes on, and she's walking through back through the floor of the fun center, and she's just like apologizing to everybody, like, I'm sorry, for earlier, like for her outburst earlier. And then it just ends. And like I said, the first time I saw it, it made me really sad, because I think I have a slightly different read on it the second time, but the first time, like, my honest reaction was, no, like, I got out of the Midnight Realm. I want her to get out too. And it felt like she wasn't going to. Like, it's the kind of thing that if she's not going to do it now, she's never going to. Yeah, do you want to talk about it before I kind of give my
Yeah,
second viewing reading?
Basically my feeling as well. And just one thing stylistically about it, because that whole section is odd. Like, there's the moment when the screaming happens and everyone else just freezes with their heads down, and then and like as you mentioned, like the names of the arcade games and stuff are all Pink Opaque references, so it feels like heightened in a way. And I just thought that was interesting. It's kind of a dreamlike thing. And then I saw on Jane's Twitter that they posted a thing about David Lynch that they really appreciate, that I thought
Yes.
totally fit with this.
Yeah.
It says,
I have not. I know that they are a fan of Twin Peaks: The Return, and that was a big inspiration. I have not watched it yet, so I can't really comment on the parallels or similarities. But it does feel like Lynchian. Does feel like a good descriptor of the film overall. Like, it feels very dreamlike.
Yeah. I agree. And I haven't watched any of the Twin Peaks, actually, and I really, really need to, but I've seen other Lynch films. But the tweet that I saw from Jane, I'm just going to read it because I thought it was really pertinent to this ending. It says, the thing Lynch does better than anyone else in the history of cinema is play with gradients of reality, starting from an understanding that all film, like life itself, can be understood as a dream. And so all film, like life itself, can feel real and unreal. And I think that first rings true with the Lynch films that I've seen, that it's like, it's not like there's clear boundaries, this is what's really happening and this is all in the actor's head, or like whatever. It's all just blended together, and that just like going for that is in this film, and especially in the last scene, I think just feels feels super Lynchian and appropriate, I think, to the style of the rest of the film. But
yeah, and I think I think at that point it is a little more clear to an audience that, like, what we are watching is like the midnight realm. Like this is not
Mm-hmm.
like the real world, at least like the world of the movie. There's a great moment like the beat earlier. Like there's a point where I can't remember like what the timeline this happening is, but when Maddie returns,
Mm-hmm.
She tells him about, do you remember what happened in the last episode of the show? And we flash back and we see him watching the tape of that episode. We see the episode that happens where where they get captured by Mr. Melancholy. And as they are feeding, like it gets to the moment where they are feeding Isabel the Luna juice to like put her to sleep and send her to the Midnight Realm, very subtly. So the way that the film has kind of presented the TV show for the entire film is like it's in this like box, like 1:1 aspect ratio, kind of like the way that TV shows used to be formatted in the 90s and everything. Like I remember, but like this is the format that Buffy was filmed in, and it's very very grainy, very like in that box ratio. Like you can tell like when you're watching the TV show. And during this sequence where Mr. Melancholy comes up and tells Isabel what he's doing and what is going to happen to her, suddenly the frames reverse, where slowly, like when we cut back to Owen watching it, the edges of the frame shrink into that box ratio and becomes like really grainy, like that old school TV show. And when we cut back to the show, quote unquote, to see Mr. Melancholy give his monologue, the frame expands to take up the full screen, and it becomes a lot clearer. And it's like we're watching the movie, and it's like the realities reverse.
Yeah,
and it becomes clear that what we've been seeing is not real, at least like in the world of the film.
Yeah,
and it's brilliant and visceral, and I didn't see it until the second viewing that I saw it, and
I didn't realize the aspect ratios changed either. I need to see it again. I really wanted to go a second time before recording, but couldn't make it.
I will probably be seeing it a third time. And the thing that I really want to pay attention to when I see it again is I want to pay really close attention to the character's eyes. Because there was something that I noticed, particularly when Maddie returns and she's telling Owen the truth about their world and who they are, and the TV show. I just suddenly noticed that like there's a light in their eyes, both of their eyes, that looks a little bit like a TV screen, like it's like present in both of their eyes. And then there are other scenes where that light is gone, but I think I remember there being serious stretches of the film where that light is present. And I really want to pay attention to that, because that plays into another very trans experience for me that like it's very common, something that we talk about a lot. That's a very common experience for us is, we typically share before and after photos of like what we looked like before we transitioned and what we look like now. And the most common thing in the world when you're looking at those things, like obviously there's a lot of big physical changes that typically are very obvious and very noticeable between the pictures. But the biggest thing that people usually see is like, oh, the eyes. Like most of us have like what we call like these dead eyes. Like there's just like, maybe we're smiling, maybe our expression is happy, but the eyes give it away that like there's just like something missing, like there's like a light that's not there. And it's usually the case that like a lot of people can't see it until they see the after picture, and that light and that joy is there, and it feels real, like there's like a light. And that was something that like one of the big indicators for me, something I remember telling people when I was in college, was that I felt like when I looked in the mirror, I looked sad. Like my eyes looked sad, and I didn't know why. And then I figured out why. And so I think that could be like, it could just, if that's something intentional that Jane is doing, I think that would be like another like crazy way that this film like captures like the trans experience. So it's like, it could just be something symbolic of like the TV, but I feel like that's just something that I picked up on, that I'm just like, that would be really cool if that is what they're doing.
Yeah, I want to go back and watch it for that and for the aspect ratio. I did notice, like, I mean, how could you not? Like the visual effects of Mr. Melancholy's face in that scene are
Oh my
incredible
god.
looking,
Oh,
and the Ice Cream Man too. But go ahead.
yeah, that's another thing too with that sequence is like the special effects. Like it starts out really like low budget, and kind of like chintzy the way that like a lot of the way that the TV show is filmed and done for the film. But the longer that sequence goes, particularly as the film grain kind of disappears from the Mr. Melancholy scene, we see like even the visual effects and the CGI get a lot more advanced and get a lot more crisp and have a lot more movement to it. And I think that's another thing too.
Yeah. Super cool. Yeah, I absolutely love this movie. I'm going to see it again in the theater.
Yes.
And
yes.
I'm trying to think if I have anything else. I don't think I have any final thoughts. Do you have anything you want to say?
I do have one more thing. Like I said, the first time I saw the movie, the ending wrecked me, was like made me so sad. And the second time I had a slightly different read. Maybe this is my biases going, because like I said, like my honest reaction, like the first time I saw it when the thing cut to black was like, no, I want her to get out too, because like that was my reaction. The second time I saw it, like again, like the ending sequence before it cuts to black is that she is walking like toward the camera. She's walking through the floor of the arcade center. I want to believe she's walking out the door. I want to believe that she's going to wake herself up.
Yeah. There's still time.
That's what I want to believe. There's still time. So So I don't know. Potentially a more hopeful read of the ending, but it
cuts before we see that. So
yes.
I think it's totally valid reading and like ambiguous on purpose that, there is still time.
Yes,
that's cool.
Absolutely.
That's beautiful. I want to thank you so much for sharing, Lara, so many of your like internal feelings about this, because that's a lot of vulnerability and I just really appreciate it. And I'm so glad to hear it. And I know that, I hope that it connects with people too. And it was funny. You just Facebook messaged me and I was like, you want to talk about this film, don't you? And I was like, I want that too. So I'm so glad that this worked out. And thanks again. And we'll have to have you back very soon.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure and a joy. And I feel like I spent most of the time talking.
That's what I wanted. So that's good.
But yeah, I think this movie is really special, and I have been like chomping at the bit for the last month. It's like I need to talk about this movie with someone, and I can't talk about it without spoiling it. So I'm like, I'm very very glad to have this outlet, and for you to be so open to hearing my experiences, because I feel that it's a scary world right now for us, and I think it's really important for people to hear our stories and see our stories and learn a little bit about our experiences. And I'm glad that I was able to have this space to share that.
Absolutely. And just to, put a pin in that, or to put a fine point on that, is just that, as I said, I think that there's ways that the film can resonate, probably universally, but absolutely like the most prominent reading, I think, is the trans reading of this film. And
this movie's going to crack some eggs.
Yeah. And I think that, I just definitely wanted to focus on that. And I knew I wasn't adequate to fully realize that. And so I thank you for coming to do that. But
of course,
yes. Well, we can wrap up there. Thanks again. And we will again have to have you back soon. This was great. And we will talk to you next time.
Of course.